Good evening. We're going to get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pamela Hughes and I manage the Friends program here at IAS. I'm delighted to welcome you and to thank you for joining us for the first Friends talk to be held in person in more than 18 months. We are thrilled to see you here and to have others joining on Zoom. It's a pleasure also to introduce today's speaker, Rosanna Dent, 2021-22 Elizabeth and J. Richardson Dilworth Fellow in the School of Historical Studies. Rosanna received her AB in biology from Brown University in 2006 and went on to the University of Pennsylvania to earn both a master's and a PhD in history and sociology of science. An assistant professor in the Federated History Department of the New Jersey Institute of Technology, Rutgers, Newark, she researches at the intersection of history of science and medicine, Latin American history, Native studies, and feminist science and technology studies. Broadly, she's interested in how human interactions unfold in the context of knowledge production and the implications of these relationships for questions of political and social justice. With support from the Mellon Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and Fulbright, Rosanna has published on the history of genetics, anthropology, and epidemiology in Brazil. She is a 2022 Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies and was previously a visiting pre-doctoral fellow at the Max Planck Center for the History of Science. In 2020, she received the prestigious John C. Burnham Early Career Award from the History of Science Society Forum for the History of the Human Science in recognition of her ongoing work exploring the history of research in indigenous Xavante communities of Brazil, the subject of her talk today. So now please join me in welcoming Rosanna Dent, who will speak with us on human subjects as research experts. There will be time for questions following the talk.
Pamela, thank you so much for that really generous introduction and for, there we go, got rid of the echo, for all your work to organize this event. Thank you all so much for being here on a Friday evening. It's really lovely to see you all. And it's my first talk in person in so long. It's very exciting. I just really need to thank the Institute. It is an amazing honor to be here this year. And part of what makes that possible is the support of the Friends of the Institute. So friends who are here, thank you so much for what you do to make it possible for us to do our scholarship in this very special place. So, as is common for historians, I would like to start with a story. In 2012, Sidowi Wa'asaze Shavante marked anthropologist Nancy Flower's return with ceremonial weeping. Tears flowed down his cheeks. He sat by her side, he placed an arm around her, and with a sonorous wail, he lamented the time that they had been apart. Nearby, someone filmed the emotion on both his and Flower's faces with a mobile phone. It had been at least 10 years since their last meeting. With his cries, and according to Awe tradition, Sidowi greeted Flowers as kin. And I think, hopefully, if it works, you should be able to hear him. This scene might have been expected in Sidowi's community, the Awe Xavante land, indigenous land of Pimentel Barbosa in central Brazil. But in this case, he was actually quite far from home. This is the land, this is his community. In fact, he was in a Rio de Janeiro penthouse apartment overlooking the Botafogo Bay. And he sat on a beige sofa rather than a stack of woven sleeping mats. At 93 years of age, Flowers had traveled from New York to visit. But due to health concerns, she really wasn't able to make the much longer journey to Mato Grosso by bus and plane. And so she couldn't go to the Aue community where she had first conducted fieldwork in 1976. So Sidowi came to her. And they were both guests in the home of anthropologists Ricardo Ventura Santos and Carlos Coimbra. Over the course of tonight, I'm going to be talking about Aue, which is the name that Sidowi's people use to refer to themselves, their auto-denomination. But many other people also refer to Aue as Chavante, and so you'll hear that in quotations that come from others. So Sidowi's presence in Rio and the connections between his community and anthropologists Flowers, Ventura Santos, and Coimbra, they're really the result of a very long process of being studied. For over half a century, Aue communities in Terra Indígena Pimentel Barbosa have been hosting scholars. And there's so many people from so many different disciplines that have visited that they actually have rather a hard time keeping track of us all. So this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of how frequently this community has been hosting researchers. And you'll note that there's a really wide variety of different disciplines. So you've got folks from the life sciences, from the human sciences, from the biomedical sciences, all going to do research in this territory. So now if you think back to the title for this talk, Human Subjects as Research Experts, you might already have a sense of where I'm going. For a whole variety of reasons, scientists have understood and thereby made certain people into sources of knowledge. And when I'm teaching about this kind of material, I find that a lot of students are really familiar with some of the most egregious or sort of iconic examples of exploitative human subjects research. For example, they often bring up Nazi experimentation. Some of them are very familiar with the United States Public Health Service's syphilis study, which is also referred to as the Tuskegee study. For those of you who might have a sort of interest in the history of medicine, you might be sort of more familiar with the ways that prisons have functioned as sites of pharmaceutical research in the mid-20th century. And these are really essential histories, of course, because they mark and shape public understandings and experiences of research and medical care. And I mean, I don't think we need more than a COVID pandemic to remind us of how much these kinds of imaginaries about scientific research really influence people's actions on a day-to-day basis, you know, in a lot of different ways. These histories are also really important because they provided the impetus for a range of reforms. They catalyzed a process that had sort of already been underway before these particular forms of research were sort of publicized, but that to formalize ethical oversight of research. That's kind of what gives rise to the IRB, the institutional review boards that are in the United States, and also a sort of process of internationalization of ethics committees, which around the world are now really tailored to meet the requirements of the US Food and Drug Administration. And also other international sort of drug development oversight. So the politics of all these changes, these particular histories are really fascinating. And I don't have time to go into all of it, of course, but if you're seeing connections to some of these issues throughout the rest of the talk, I'd love you to bring them to the discussion at the end. What I will say is that I'm drawing here on some really wonderful work by Nancy Campbell and Laura Stark. And one of the things that they talk about in their work is that these changes, the sort of publicity around some of these issues of human subjects research, they really led to a new vision of human subjects research. And that's not just for scientists or biomedical researchers or just for the general public, but that's also influenced historians. And as they argue, this emergence of a particular kind of notion of a so-called vulnerable subject has really shaped the way that people understand their own prior experience if they participated in research, but it's also shaped how historians write and think about the past. So these exploitative studies have certain similarities with some of the research histories that I'm going to speak about today. They took place across really great power differentials, for example. The potential for harm is often really centered with the subjects rather than the researchers. The researchers are much more likely to benefit from the research. But if we started to think about the studies that I'm going to talk about today only through a lens of vulnerable subjects, we would really be missing some very important and interesting things. And something that I think has really been overlooked in the history of science is that when researchers kind of identify a group of people as informing some pressing research question, when that group of people is also considered in some way to be scarce, those groups actually tend to really accumulate experience and knowledge of research. And this is true, I think, for many Indigenous groups. There's even a joke, right, about that gets told in different Indigenous groups. I know Diné tell this joke, for example, that the classic Diné family is a mother, a father, 2 children, and an anthropologist, right? So there's this kind of notion that certain groups of people are really overstudied. But this is also true for patient populations, maybe, who are suffering from uncommon ailments. It might be true for communities that are located near large research institutions. But there's very little scholarship that's actually looked at how these iterative experiences of being studied shape the direction of future research. So if we start paying attention to the layers of experience that have accumulated over time, practices of hospitality, for example, for human subjects who actually host their researchers, then what we start to see is that sometimes the subjects themselves become experts, and in turn, they may actually help transform the way that people do scientific research. So, to return to the Awe territory of Pimentel Barbosa, that bond that Sidowi vocalized with his welcome for flowers, it brings our attention to intimate, affective, and temporal dimensions of knowledge making in the field. And over the rest of the talk, I'm going to kind of explore how that bond formed and grew. And I hope you'll see 3 things as I do this. First, I'd like you to start seeing that Sidowi was one of many people who actually provided the necessary labor to sustain scientific work. So in part, this is a story about labor. Next, I think that by reconceptualizing Sidowi and others like him as experts in research, it actually helps us to understand the political contexts that have really shaped choices that people make to participate in and even cultivate research. And finally, I'm going to kind of suggest that acknowledging human subjects' central role in knowledge making will really open up some new ways to think about generating research questions, thinking about systems of governance for research, and thinking about products that will actually closely meet the needs of the people who are being studied. So how exactly did Sidowi's community come to be a site of research? So just to give you a little bit of a better sense of where it is we're talking about, here you can see a map of Brazil, the location of Mato Grosso in central Brazil, and you can see there a map of the Terra Indígena Pimentel Barbosa. In the background, you can see a picture of the Cerrado. So a lot of people, when I talk about Brazil, imagine that we're talking about the Amazon jungle, but we're not. We're talking about a savanna ecosystem, which is really important. It's a different thing. And I think in order to really understand some of these relationships, we need to contextualize this history in the relationship between Awe communities and the Brazilian state. And that's actually a history that dates back all the way to the 18th century. So a period when Awe communities came into conflict with explorers and colonists. And there was a period where a number of communities who had been displaced by expansionism actually went to live in settlements that were organized by the colonial governors. And they went kind of following these particular promises about steady access to food, about having shelter, that didn't turn out to be so true. And so within a couple decades, they got really disillusioned with the settler organization, and they left. They moved west. They moved away from warfare and competition over resources with settlers, and they reestablished their independence further west. And it wasn't, and here you can just, if you want a little close up of this beautiful map, you can see there the land that's marked as the land of heathen Chavante. So it wasn't until the 20th century, in the 1930s and 40s, that the Awe again became famous, or maybe for the first time became famous in Brazil. And this was because of their very fierce resistance to what the Brazilian government called pacification. They drew attention of the national press, of the because they basically were repeatedly killing people who would come and trespass in their territory. And that was resistance that they applied to missionaries, to ranchers, and also to state agents. And this was right at this very critical moment of aggressive state expansionism. There was a corporatist dictatorship at the time under the leadership of President Getulio Vargas, and he had this program called the March to the West, which was kind of exactly what it sounds like. It was a program to open up the interior of the country for economic development. And Awe territory, which is in eastern Mato Grosso, lay sort of directly in one of the main lines that they were trying to open up. And the hostilities actually stopped the process of this expedition for a period of 2 years. And this was like a big embarrassment for the Vargas presidency. And so there was a lot of attention. And here you can see a cover story from a very popular magazine at the time called O Cruzeiro from 1944 that ran, which gives you a sense of how this was publicized. So in 1946, when the first Awe community actually accepted official contact with the Brazilian government, kind of established diplomatic relations, it made national news. It even made international news. It was actually a very big story at the time. And that community that made that contact was the community where Sidobi's parents lived. The government promptly claimed that they had pacified all of the Chavante, all of the Awe, when in fact what they had done was really establish contact with one of many different groups who don't have a unified system of governance. So it was sort of a false notion. But they went about establishing relationships through giving a lot of gifts, which also involved giving a lot of tools that could be used as weapons. This kind of fueled internal warfare among Awe communities. And it basically was the way that they started to establish a sort of ongoing presence in Awe territory. So they built a post near that very first village, and that is where they had a government nurse sometimes, a teacher sometimes, but mostly just a single agent who looked after things in that post. So this is also right about the time that researchers started to pay attention to Awe. And keep in mind that they were talking about these groups as being untouched, as being unimpacted by colonialism. They were really understanding them as being isolated and completely separate. But you can see that there was a much longer history of impact that had already started to change things in Awe communities. So just to remind you where we are in this long list of researchers, just at the beginning, the first studies were conducted in this community in 1958 by David Maybury Lewis and his family. He spent, and here you can see a picture of him holding his son. They spent 8 months in the community conducting an anthropological study. And right after that, just a few years later, he actually returned with a group of geneticists who did a sort of broad study about health and human variation. And this really established, these were two major pilot studies that kind of established fields of study for their respective disciplines. But 1962 was just before the rise of the Brazilian military dictatorship. And In the wake of the 1964 dictatorship beginning, I would say that the developmentalist agenda really only accelerated. And so, the conditions were not great. In 1968, for example, there was an investigation that was done in Brazil about the government's administration of indigenous affairs, and it found widespread corruption. Until the end of the dictatorship, until the Constitution of 1988, indigenous people were not even considered full citizens in Brazil. They were sort of managed, they were understood to be sort of managed through a practice called tutelage. And it's hard to tell these histories right now at this moment, because what's going on in Brazil under the Bolsonaro administration, it's probably the lowest point that we've seen since this period. It's certainly of comparable risk to indigenous communities right now. And it was under this time, really under duress, that Aue became very politically adept at lobbying for their interests. So this is a photo from a little bit later, but what you can see here is a group from the community that I'm talking about in the FUNAI headquarters, in the government administration headquarters, making a case for their land claims to the president of the government agency. So it was right around this period that Nancy Flowers actually arrived to conduct her doctoral research. So Flowers is a North American anthropologist. She had interests in human ecology, and she's a great, wonderful case because she went back to do her PhD in her 50s. It's never too late, so you can still consider a whole new career. And in her 50s, she had been a very successful photojournalist, and she went back to do a PhD and conducted 14 months of field work in Sidowi's community. And her work was part of a comparative study that was really trying to complicate earlier accounts of indigenous societies in central Brazil that had painted them as kind of static, as frozen in time, as not dynamic. And so what her research group was trying to do was to understand the sort of changing socioeconomic conditions that were accompanying colonial expansion. So she did things like she was collecting data on child mortality, on subsistence activities, on food intake, and then those data would be compared with data from 3 other lowland Brazilian indigenous groups. And so even though she was very experienced in life, a little bit older than a lot of first-time PhD students, she was a novice in ethnographic field work. But within 3 days of arriving in the field, she realized that her hosts had already labeled her as a researcher. They knew exactly what she was doing there. It was her 3rd day in the field. She sat in the shade for a moment, and a woman standing nearby took it upon herself to teach a lesson in social organization. Fernanda, the woman, had no command of Portuguese, but she started, and this is interesting, by teaching the new visitor the names of Aue age groups. So age groups are like age cohorts where everybody within a 5-year period goes into one age cohort or age group, and that kind of structures certain activities and things that people do in social life in the community. But it's kind of an abstract thing, and why would you start with that? And Fernanda was kind of displeased with the way that the anthropologist was responding, and Nancy Flowers wrote about that in her field journal that night. She said I should write them down right away, like David always did, but I had my cameras with me and not a notebook. Very bad, one should always carry a notebook. So almost immediately, Flowers is identified with the anthropologist who had been there before her. And Aue interlocutors were actually paying attention to content. So Mayberry Lewis had been there to do a structuralist analysis. And that meant figuring out all the institutions that kind of made up political life in Aue communities. And age groups are kind of a hard thing to figure out. And so he would have to ask repeated questions over and over and over again to try and work out how these institutions worked in the community. And so Fernanda's choice of what to teach on the 3rd day that Flowers was in the field shows that, you know, at least some residents really already had a clear notion of what it was about Aue culture that anthropologists wanted to know. So community members stepped up to teach all kinds of things that Flowers wanted to learn. One of the things she did was she was trying to understand food intake, and so she would spend 24 hours in a household measuring and describing every single thing that was eaten. So you can imagine how intrusive that would be if someone came into your kitchen and wanted to write down everything you ate for a period of 24 hours, and she did it multiple times. They taught her about planting, they taught her about harvesting, gathering, they taught her about hunting, and they also hunted for her. They were her source of fresh meat while she was living there. They brought her their children to be weighed and measured. They taught her vocabulary. They sat for interviews and in some cases provided interpretation. She didn't ever manage to really learn to speak Awe. It's an extremely difficult language for me, at least. They even built her a house. So I hope that you're getting a sense, like, honestly, hosting researchers is just a massive amount of work. We're really high maintenance. It's also worth noting that researchers were expected already to document things, right? She's telling her to write it down. And residents were particularly delighted by certain aspects of Flowers' recording technologies. So she had this great idea to take a Polaroid camera into the field with her. And she used it to learn who lived in which house, to learn their names and how they were related to each other, which was important for the anthropological work that she did. But she also took an extra picture every time she took a photo in the house, and she gave it to the household. So they had for the first time a photograph of themselves. And here, if you look at Warodi, in this photo, he's one of the leaders who worked with her very closely. You can see that he's holding his copy of a Polaroid there as it dries. But Flowers was also recording things at a very precarious and a very difficult moment that the community was facing. So page after page in her field notes documents the encroachments of ranchers. She recorded a very big fight to try to correct official maps that had switched boundary names, which meant that Awe territory was sort of dramatically reduced. And she was directed by leaders in the community to take photographs of territorial markers. This is also a period where health was a big issue. And so her notes document epidemics of flu and pneumonia. And she spent a lot of time doing her best. She had no medical training, but she spent a lot of time giving out the medications that she had with her. She often paid for transport for young people, for people who were ill to the hospital, which was very expensive. And among her many different interventions, she's credited with saving the life of one of Sidoi's daughters. So in her dissertation, Flowers wrote about residents' requests for medical assistance, for language classes, for math classes. Leaders asked her to lobby on their behalf when she traveled to Brasilia or when she went back to the United States. But Flowers she didn't really think she had the training, that she had the time, that she had the right expertise or authority for these kinds of activities. She sort of privileged her scientific work. She had a very modest or skeptical view of her own ability to help. But I think she also lacked a little bit of a sense of her full potential. And so although she failed to lobby in the 1970s when she was there, she did follow through on a promise to come back. So I just want to step back for a minute, remind you where we are, remind you where we're going. Hopefully by now I've convinced you that it's a lot of labor to host researchers. And I'm working on building a case here for the insight that's provided into the political context and motivations of research subjects by paying attention to these iterative experiences of being studied. And so I'm going to keep working on that. I've got some more for you before I kind of move to that final question. So in 1989, Flowers met two young Brazilian anthropologists, dynamic, newly completed their doctorates at Indiana University, Ricardo Ventura Santos and Carlos Coimbra. They were just beginning careers at the Escola Nacional de Saúde Pública, which is part of it's the National Public Health School. It's part of a prestigious research institution in Brazil called Fiocruz, and located in Rio de Janeiro. So the three of them hatched a plan to restudy the questions that Flowers had looked at during her doctoral research. It's now 15 years later. What's changed? They were particularly interested in the depth of data that had accumulated over the many researchers' visits in this one particular community. And that would allow them to answer questions that were impossible to address just through short-term research. And so here you can see them, or some of them. Nancy Flowers is there with the white t-shirt, and you can see in the red t-shirt, that's Ricardo Ventura Santos, with 3 of their students. And then Supto Buprewairi Shavanche, who is a leader now in the community, and he worked very closely with them. So within a few years of beginning their work, you can see that they already started to train graduate students. Every year, they introduced new scholars and new topics for investigation. And basically each dry season, they'd show up, and eventually the village almost became like a field school. In 2014, Carlos Coimbra, here you can see him in the blue t-shirt, he remembered this. He commented to me in an oral history interview, quote, "Today I wouldn't even be able to tell you exactly how many people have done their thesis work with the Xavante." So in turn, Awe participated in this process of training the researchers about what they should do, how they should behave, teaching basic language skills, working as interpreters for each new student, and so on. And over time, and with this kind of continued interaction with researchers, they also started to push attention to community concerns. So as the 1990s wore on, for example, diabetes and other chronic non-communicable diseases became increasingly prevalent. And in response, leaders started to kind of gently insist that the researchers should look at these chronic health problems. Coimbra, remembering this in this oral history, said to me, quote, "Really, to be honest, at first when they started to talk to me about diabetes, it took me about 2 years to come to terms with the fact that I couldn't escape. It took me a while to get up the nerve, but then we did it." So the research group basically had to open up new lines of investigation. And that's a major shift, to shift from studying the ecology of infectious disease, which is one set of literature and experience and knowledge, to focusing on metabolic disorders, which is really a very different field. But they did it because the community asked them to. And so community leaders have become more and more proactive about advocating certain lines of research. And you can see this, I think, as an example with the work of anthropologist James Welsh. So we'll turn to him now for a minute. As he completed his research for a PhD in the mid-2000s, and he had a series of conversations with Supto about geographical information systems, GIS. And Supto was really interested in this technology, and it actually turned into a new project on the ecology of fire hunting. So this wasn't random. Supto was building common ground with Welsh based on his interest in human ecology, based on his curiosity about the relationship of young people to land. And so Supto really drew the researchers' attention to the ways that for years, neighboring ranchers had criticized Awe seasonal hunts and the use of fire. And basically what they do with the fire hunting is they set a ring of fire and they drive game animals toward one point so that they can have a more successful hunt at that moment. And it's only done at a very specific time of the year. The ranchers accused them of causing deforestation. And this is really a pretense to undermine land claims, to say that Indigenous people are not good at taking care of their own land, and therefore their land should be limited, right? But I just want you to think about who's doing a good job of taking care of the land, because here you can see on the right-hand side the territory of Pimentel Barbosa, and on the left-hand side you can see the territory of the nearby ranchers and what the landscape looks like. So Welsh and collaborators began a series of studies on the ecological impact of the practice of fire hunting. But Welsh's study was not by any means the first of its kind. It joined 7 prior studies. And Welsh talked about this to me in an interview saying, quote, "There's this huge amount of literature on the subject, actually, and it's not by chance. Most of the research on the relationship between Cerrado ecology and Indigenous societies was done in Pimentel Barbosa," end quote. And so ecological studies backed with GIS imagery provided scientific evidence for the ecological benefit of the practice of fire hunting. It actually increases biodiversity, and it prevents larger, hotter fires. And obviously you can probably think, I don't know how many of you have been paying attention to what's been going on in Brazil, but it's a body of knowledge that I think will be essential in decades to come. You know, there have been these widespread burnings happening in Brazil, much more than usual. So the scientific studies actually provided a kind of needed form of evidence where ranchers and government officials wouldn't respect traditional knowledge. And I want to underline here, on one hand, it seems like a happy story, like this is a positive thing, right? And I think that it is in certain ways, but there's an underlying reality that actually pushes our way to engage with scientists on these issues. And that is that indigenous knowledge and expertise is completely discounted by the Brazilian legal system, by mainstream media, right? And so basically what they have to do is they have to teach an outsider what they already know. The outsider has to basically prove it within a different knowledge system, which is the knowledge system of science, in order for it to be taken seriously. And I think that that's actually it's not really a happy story, right? And there's another really important example of this kind of double bind of needing to work with researchers in order to make community knowledge visible to the state. And that is the question of land claims. Here we go. So after finishing his doctoral studies, James Welsh joined the Fiocruz team of public health researchers. And within a short time, in 2009, community leaders actually reached out to them and asked them to conduct a study to try to regain a large area of their territory called BDZ that had been taken and sold by government agents in the 1960s. Here you can see where we are in the timeline. Leaders from all of the communities in the territory, it started with one community, but over time, the villages split and turned into many communities. There's 11, I think, today. Leaders from all the communities came together and decided that the public health researchers were going to be their best option. Their research team had been there for almost 20 years doing different kinds of work. Coimbra, Ventura, Santos, and Welsh really had a sense of obligation. And so, you know, they kind of explained this to me saying like, well, we couldn't say no, right? And they spent months unpaid by the government preparing a 300-page report for the demarcation. They mobilized 50 years of data. They used Mayberry Lewis's monographs from the 1960s. They used Flowers' field notes from the 1970s. They used hundreds of other sources. So they drew on layer after layer of publication and study to document all the different factors that are required by the government. They need to have data about land tenure, about ceremonial spaces, about ethnobotanical resources, all kinds of evidence. And so when the government agency actually accepted their technical report, it meant that 150,000 hectares of Awe land entered the legal process for demarcation. So that was in 2011. It was a moment where new indigenous territories were being recognized, although not like today where no new lands are really being recognized. But unfortunately, the legal decision is still pending. So we don't actually know what's going to come of this, but it was accepted by the government agency. So in 2012, when Nancy Flowers was welcomed in Rio by Sidowi and his weeping, his tears were for a woman who had played an important role in his life. Sidowi credited Flowers with saving his daughter. He worked with her on many occasions over almost 4 decades. They had exchanged gifts and food, and her work, her documentation, contributed to the formal identification of the land where he was born, which is a step, although not complete, towards recovering an area of land that was critical to his community. And here you can see, I don't have a wonderful picture of Wedeze, but there it is across the river. So this isn't, it's not it could come across as this is like, the only time that this happened. But actually, in general, anthropologists have been very involved in Brazil in doing demarcation reports. It's kind of become almost like an expected service that an anthropologist will do for a community where they have a long history of working together. And it's actually formalized that anthropologists are privileged to do these reports because for so many years, the reports were terrible quality. And so the Brazilian Anthropological Association and the Attorney General made an agreement that anthropologists should be involved in this process to try and improve it. I want to be clear that in highlighting this small political victory, I don't mean to say that land demarcation as a process is unproblematic. There's a particular logic here that ties Indigenous communities to specific pieces of land, and that can entirely fail to contemplate the kind of dynamic relationship that a lot of Indigenous groups have with their land. And that kind of state recognition it can be very limiting. And scholars have shown that this is something that is done in order to also free up other areas of land for extractive industry, for mining, for agricultural use, sugar and soy, things like that. But still, for the growing population in Pimentel Barbosa, the return of Wedeze, if it's finalized, will be a spiritual and a social victory. So the pattern that I hope is clear from this list of scholars, right, is that in the context of long-term relationships, Awe villagers really work to address some of the many injustices that they face as they subtly and sometimes not so subtly shape the agendas of their scientific visitors. So by now I'm hoping that I've convinced you that leaders and residents in Pimentel Barbosa have become experts on cultivating researchers, and that Awe who work with researchers are much more than vulnerable human subjects, even if they have major vulnerabilities as well. They face political contexts that really influence their choices to participate in and sometimes to shape research. And I hope that you've started to see how acknowledging human subjects' central role in knowledge creation, which increasingly researchers have done over time, it also opens up new models to generate research questions, to think about systems of governance for research, and to create products that are more closely meeting subjects' needs. And so I'll turn to one last example, and this one's very short, so bear with me, we're almost there. But I did want to talk a little bit about what all this has meant for me and for my most recent collaborative work with my subjects, who are the scientists, and their subjects, who are my Awe collaborators on this project. So here we are. Early in my first visit to Terra Indígena Pimentel Barbosa, which was in 2015, Sidowi was the first person to take time to really speak and work with me. And to give you kind of a sense of the scene on that first meeting, we were sitting in his house on two plastic chairs. There's sort of a laptop propped up on a stool in the middle between our chairs, and there was an audio recorder kind of balanced on there. And he and I had just spent some time looking through a series of digitized photographs, which I'd scanned from books, from researchers' personal papers, their collections. And these images, and you've seen some of these images over the course of this evening already, they documented the village in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So he recorded a reflection on the work of researchers who had come before me. And as he did so, he actually drew me into their lineage. He told me, quote, "You're going to do important work. You're going to bring back the work of people who passed through the village." And his speech to me was not a simple recording of memories that were jogged by the images, but it was more like an enjoinder to do work that would serve the community, because I was a complete novice. It was my first time there. I had no idea what I was doing. And this is kind of what began the digital archive project that I'm working on. So Community members give it the name Rawasu'u. It's a term that has kind of a broad semantic domain. It means sort of like to show, but it also means to tell. It also gets translated in Portuguese as história, which is story, but also history. And so when I started out, all I had was kind of this hard drive of scanned images and a set of questions about, what should I do with scientific material that was created under a really wide range of power dynamics and levels of consent? Right? Some of this material is problematic. Some of it is less problematic, but there's a whole range in there. And how could that responsibly be returned to the community that it documented? So that was the beginning, but it's blossomed into a collaboration. This is not the kind of work that you can do by yourself. And so I'm working with 3 other non-Awe colleagues, James Welsh, Laura Yankee, and Laura Graham. We started with 1 community, but we're actually in the process of scaling up to work with 5 Awe communities who are all in the same territory. And the project is to digitize and make available all of this material, photographs, audio recordings created by researchers over the years. We've also created a digital library. There's over 900 publications about Awe, life, history, health, all kinds of things. And so we're trying to do this, we're doing this work, we're creating this archive through a content management system called Mukatu. It's basically like a data infrastructure that's designed specifically for Indigenous archives. It's used by a lot of different Native groups in North America. And Mukatu employs a series of kind of locally defined cultural protocols to restrict or facilitate access to content. So what that means is, and here you can see a community meeting where we're discussing the project. What that means is that community members can decide if something should be visible. Should it be visible to the public? Should it be visible to anyone who's Awe? Is it maybe something that like non-Awe people shouldn't have access to, but Awe people can look at? Or is it something that maybe it should only belong to the village, knowledge that should be local, that should be kept close, that belongs to certain families or belongs to certain community, that they want to keep private? They'll have the ability to restrict that. And so the Awe researchers on our team can have this kind of granular control about how they want to curate and how they want to share their data in ways that are socially and culturally appropriate. And Sidowi was really a driving force behind this. Unfortunately, he passed away, joined the ancestors in 2017, but he helped to set in motion a project that I would really have never imagined on my own. And so I just want to close, go back to this question of land, of labor, of knowledge making otherwise. And this story might seem really far away, Awe territory. The dynamics may seem distant, although hopefully by now they feel a little more close. You have an idea of what this is like. But here at the IAS, our knowledge making is also possible due to the labor and land of others. The IAS, as you might know, sits in Lenape-Hoking, the traditional territory of Lenni Lenape, Indigenous people of this place. They've also been profoundly impacted by colonial expansion. First, the colonial government, then the United States government forced many Lenape west to what's currently Oklahoma, or displaced them north to Wisconsin and in Ontario, or others continue to live and thrive here in New Jersey in this region. And since the arrival of settlers, Lenape communities, their sacred sites, their ancestral remains have all been studied by scientists. Some of these histories are the same kind of egregious examples of human subjects research. But there's space for us to work to repair some of that damage. And in fact, just last week, language keepers and leaders from the Munsee Lenape Nation of Ontario were here at the IAS and at Princeton to begin a process of building relationships that might lead to new forms of knowledge making. And so I think that I'm trying to bring this back to the importance of shifting the power dynamics in research. This importance also extends to this place and to the time that we have here into this place where we're so privileged to live and work this year at the IAS. And that also is indebted to the care and work of the incredible staff at the Institute who do so much to keep these spaces clean, beautiful, the institution running. And so our work is possible due to their labor, and it's really not possible to thank them enough. So hopefully I've given you some food for thought about human subjects and how we might think about research in new ways. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.